So the first speaker, of course, will be Dr. Antonia Moon, I'm very pleased is with us today. She's, of course, the archivist working on the India Office Library records and has a phenomenal knowledge of these archives. And she's going to be talking to us today on some sources for the meteorology of the Indian Ocean world. And she'll be followed, and I will not take very much time, will be followed by Rob Allen, who again is the scientific manager of the Met Office, leading the ACRE initiative, which he'll be talking about. And he'll be talking about ACRE experiences with the Indian Ocean World Archives. And finally, we'll have Greg Bankoff, who's an environmental historian, who's worked at the University of Hull, but we are very glad to embrace him warmly at the Center for World Environmental History, from where he'll be now associated. So welcome to him, and he'll be talking to us about climate and environmental history. So that's our offer for you today. And please, we're very happy to share these riches with you. Yeah. Over to you, Antonia. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Vanita. I'm going to briefly outline some sources for the study of meteorology in the India Office records. It's going to be a short overview focusing on the 19th century because I understand this is one area of interest to you. And while much of our material isn't online, I'll draw your attention to where it is because this will be easier for those of you who can't consult our collections in person. And I've also put many links in the presentation. I'm not going to click through on these, but you'll be given the presentation afterwards so you can follow these up in your own time. I'm a curator with the India Office records, which are held at the British Library in London. The records are those created by the colonial administration in London of the pre-1947 Government of India, and there are 14 kilometres of them. They're a composite archive. They comprise the archives of the East India Company, which was the trading association set up in 1600, which gained exclusive rights to trade to the East Indies. The records of the British Government Board of Control, which supervised the company when it became a territorial administrator, and the records of the India Office, the Department of State, which replaced the company in 1858, and the Burma Office, which became a separate department in 1937. And the records are public records. This means everybody has a right to consult them, and they're supplemented, the official records, by collections of private papers, which we're still acquiring today. Now, the company in the 17th and 18th century recognized the importance of climate and tidal movements to navigation, human settlement, and economic activity. Our earliest recorded data is found in our long series of ships' logs, which were kept on the voyages to India and China and maintained by the company for their own reference. And the next speaker is going to tell you more about that particular source. The company set up weather observatories in their main settlements in Madras, Bombay, and Bengal, as well as many local weather stations. But the impetus to develop meteorological science really came with natural disasters. Certainly when the cyclone hit Bengal in 1864 and was followed by famine in Orissa 2 years later, the link between climate and human welfare began to be understood. In 1875, the Meteorological Department of India was set up under Henry Blandford to bring together and to systematize the work that was going on in all the regional observatories and weather stations. And this work, of course, was made easier by the improved communications by this time, particularly the electric telegraph, which made it possible to record weather across neighboring regions such as the Arabian Sea and to monitor phenomena such as monsoons and cyclones. Now, some of our records are straightforward for a researcher to find. Most obviously are meteorological serials. This series was artificially created by archivists in the 1960s, and what they did was bring together many official publications around this single theme. It's quite an assortment, quite a ragbag of material, and this is how it subdivides on our catalogue. You have publications from observatories going back a very long way. Government printing was cheap in India, and it was much earlier than sort of corresponding government printing in London. So you've got, for instance, astronomical observations made at the East India Company's Observatory at Madras, 1812 to 1823, right up to things like rainfall of daily rainfall in Burma, 1938 to 1941, a short series. We also have series of annual reports which were put out by the departments of the Indian central government and provincial administrations. And the relevant ones are the annual reports of the Meteorological Department of India, of the provincial meteorological reporters, and the provincial observatories. The example I've put here is the report of the Meteorological Department of India of 1890 by John Elliot. And these reports, they follow a standard format. What you're going to get is a narrative introduction, which acts as a commentary on the many pages of tabular data which follow. You'll see what's covered here from the introduction: solar radiation, temperature of the air, wind direction, cloud properties, rainfall, and so on. And what the narrative does is it takes particular note of any deviation from the established patterns and any unusual weather events of the year. In order to produce its annual returns to Parliament, the India Office required each administration in India to produce an annual report covering every department. So this is like one step up from the departmental reports. And the information in these follows a set classification. You've got weather information included under the rubric production and distribution in the context of crop yield and the work of botanical gardens and experimental farms. Because these records are so rich, we are actually doing an experiment to try and put some of them onto Wikisource. So I shall perhaps let Vanita know when they are indeed on there. Administration reports not only for India, but also for the Gulf, where the government of India had several political residencies, and they're in similar format, but the great advantage of these is that they are all online. They're part of a large-scale collaborative project between the British Library and the Qatar National Library. And for any of you with an interest in the Gulf region, I do recommend that you consult the site. I've got the links there, because you've got information and data from weather stations in Muscat and Sharjah, Bahrain and Bushehr. It's not systematic, but it does go up to about the 1950s, and it's beautifully presented. So to summarize, these are the useful publications and links. The difference between the first one and the last two is that the last two are business as usual, that is, they're reviews of regular work year on year. And things that aren't in the normal run of business, things like special research reports, will be placed in the V18 series or other occasional publications. I mean, the special research reports of the Indian Meteorological Department, for instance, you'll find in that list of serials. I've added down the bottom some sources outside the library where you can come across a few of these publications. Again, the coverage is patchy. There's no systematic runs of material online, but certainly I noticed that the National Library of India is really active in putting stuff up on the Internet archives. So it's something one can revisit, go back to, and Jeep is another good source for that. I'll now turn to sources which don't flag up their meteorological content in their titles. Oops, dear, I've gone too far. There's much relevant information in the archives on medical and military affairs. Indeed, medicine was military medicine for a long time because all the medics were in the employ of the East India Company's armies. And the success of the whole imperial project did rest on the health of the troops. So the link between climate and health was persistently made. And for much of the 19th century, miasmic theories of disease prevailed, and so cholera and so forth was thought to be spread by bad air. And a significant and far-reaching report was this one, the Royal Commission on the Sanitary State of the Army in India. And this contains an appendix on India's climate, which was drawn up by the Secretary to the British Meteorological Society, James Glaisher. And it's a mass of statistical data drawn from the official records and interpreted by Glaisher. And it's a wonderful, impressive sort of synthesis. And like all commissions would look beyond India to find comparable and relevant information. And here you've got, the report includes a long section on the climate of Western Australia, which was proposed as a convalescent location for sick soldiers. This is available, this report, on Parliamentary Papers Online. It's a subscription service, but your university might well subscribe to it. And other reports that address climate include things like the Leprosy Commission of 1890, which draws attention to the higher incidence of leprosy in damp regions. The Royal Commission's report led to the appointment of sanitary commissioners in the provinces who oversaw the work of the district civil surgeons, and some of the observations of these men on the ground filter through into the monthly proceedings of the provincial governments. We have a long series of sanitary commission proceedings and reports. We've now put many online through our Medical History of British India website. I've put the link there. I've called it India Office Medical Archives. I've picked this example of the proceedings of the Madras Sanitary Commission of 1866 because it contains interesting reflections on the work of data collection and data presentation. Regretting the scarcity of weather observations in the past, the Commission recommended that a network of properly equipped observation stations be set up across the Presidency. And Surgeon William Smith proposed a visual form of presentation as most effective for comparing information between weather and mortality. You can see up the top here, he says, quote, "The mind is apt to become bewildered, if not disgusted, among a mass of figures." And with this in mind, this is the kind of presentation you see more and more in our reports, a visual mapping of, say, disease mortality rates against prevailing weather conditions. And these come as foldouts in sort of the standard reports. Now, a mass of figures seems a good point perhaps to pause, because the quantitative data that we hold is obviously valuable, but one should bear its limitations in mind. Whether online or in physical form, the sources are very rarely complete. I was trying actually to think of some online digital resource that was complete, and the only one I could think of was the Parliamentary Papers Online, which I've mentioned, and I think you will actually find every parliamentary publication on that. But if you look at heritage organisations like ours, we're going to have gaps in our holdings, and we're certainly going to have gaps in what we digitise, and sometimes these are silent gaps, they're not actually sort of flagged up. And then within the material itself, the data obviously is inaccurate. Sometimes it can be missing, or it can be deliberately excluded. The commentaries are full of warnings about faulty instruments, incompetent recording, missing registers, and so on. In 1873, for instance, the rainfall calculations for Bombay were discovered to have been out by a margin of 20% for the previous 22 years. Geographical bias is because recording stations were placed where people could get to. They weren't distributed evenly. And more printed statistics survive than manuscript ones do. They're also much easier, of course, to read. And this means that there is an imbalance in what gets used, what gets cited, and therefore brought into the corpus of known source material. Big crowdsourcing transcription projects are wonderful, but they are not that common. Some tips when navigating the archives: do look at the context of your source. Book catalogues are presented at a single level. You've got one entry, one book, but archive catalogues have several levels, and they move from the general to the particular. You'll find that keyword searches will usually land you in the particular, so you should navigate up through the hierarchy. I've just put an example here from our catalogue, but any archive catalogue is going to do the same thing. You see you've found a letter about a grant to the government astronomer at Madras, but you have to move upwards, see the context to see that it comes from London to India in the public department of the India Office of 1867. And of course, context is crucially important when you're considering the archive in front of you. Before I leave the subject of medical sources, I'd like to draw your attention to one particular kind, which is medical topographies. And these are reports by medical officers on the soils, vegetation, topography, and climate of the place, undertaken to assess its suitability for the settlement of troops. And we've got about 50 medical topographies among the official publications of the India Office record, and there are also more online, the main library catalogue. and many can now be read online, like this one here. The blue hits are just the results of a simple search within the volume under the word climate. And other topographies were published in the transactions of learned societies, such as the Medical and the Physical Societies of Calcutta and Bombay. These topographies include information on temperature, atmosphere, rainfall, and winds, usually traced over the course of a calendar year, and they take care to distinguish microclimates, observing differences between one place and another a few miles away. And throughout, the discussion is presented in terms of health, as you see here. But I chose this one because it illustrates another point, which is that topographers don't only look at the prevailing conditions, they gather information as well from the past. They read reports from earlier explorers and they question people whom they meet. So this is John McClelland in 1844, and he's recorded the fall of ice in Bangalore 22 years earlier and the failure of 4 crops of hay the year before that. And so this is really a great advantage that a narrative source like a topography or an essay or a private letter has over statistical sources. It can often capture this sort of little shreds of information that you're really not likely to find anywhere else. And another sort of advantage of this kind of narrative is that it can tell you about the weather as it was actually experienced. And these quotations from medical topographies show you, I picked them just because they can show you how experience can contradict hard data. And it's just a simple reminder that quantitative and qualitative sources do shed light on each other. One other area within the official records to mention, the East India Company devoted enormous efforts to improving agricultural production for the simple reason that more produce meant more revenues. And discussions about the weather are obviously going to feature strongly here. I've actually got a guide to our sources for agriculture in print, which I can pass on if anyone wants to see it. So just let me know. And the public proceedings of each administration carry a lot of information, but you're also going to find information about the weather in journals of agri-horticultural societies like this one, or in scientific publications like the one in the middle there, resulting from experimental work. I think that's comparing Punjab wheat data with the climatic conditions. And obviously there were catastrophic agricultural failures, and the famines are comprehensively documented in the records. The item on the right is from Alan Octavian Hume, who was then secretary to the Indian government, seeking more information about food scarcity in Bengal. You're going, I think, to be looking at sources for famine in this period. And in the workshop, I think you're going to be looking at the Sanitary Commission report. And of course, Sanitary was extremely interested in meteorology, so that would come through in that report. Our private papers contain several collections of men who are professional surveyors or whose own natural curiosity led them to take an interest in meteorology. I've picked out these because they're the sort of big beasts in terms of private collections. They're all from the first part of the 19th century. If you click on the links, you can read all about who they were, but I will simply pick out Colin Mackenzie, who was Surveyor General of India, and Brian Houghton Hodgson, who was the company's resident in Nepal, who found himself with a lot of time on his hands, and he turned his attentions to meteorology. And the 2 illustrations on the right are from Hodgson's papers. He's put barometer and thermometer kept at Kathmandu in the midst of the valley of Nepal. And on the top, it's one of his many meteorological registers. On the left, you've got a page from Mackenzie's meteorological observations for Mysore. And this just gives you a kind of idea of the detailed information you're going to find in these manuscripts. And these are the large collections. If you're digging further into little collections, usually by keyword searches, you are going to find more material. We are extremely conscious that our records are colonial records, and as such, they represent a narrow perspective. The British Library holds much material in the languages of South Asia, and some of this is gradually becoming more visible online. It's always accessible in the catalogues, but this current project, 2 Centuries of Indian Print, has digitized over 1,000 Bengali books, and it's now extending to cover other South Asian languages. And I asked my colleagues in this area what they had on climate science, and they drew my attention to several books, like this one, which is a description of the cyclone in 1864 in Calcutta, written in poem and drama formats. If you click through, you can have a look at it. And these resources, I would imagine, are very underexplored. So their digitization is timely. If you think of a book like Geoffrey Parker's Global Crisis, War, Climate and Catastrophe in the 17th century, that really sets the standard for its use of multilingual resources to recover personal experiences of climate disasters. I mean, just this appendix is wonderful for an archivist just to read through. And certainly we have much important work as archivists to do in identifying and establishing links to these different sources. I'll mention in passing the Endangered Archives project hosted by the British Library, which digitizes at-risk archives across the world, which is another portal for exploring resources in many languages. I did notice Dibodre Das on the call just now, and obviously he is actually, he's done an Endangered Archives project, so would be perhaps could sort of tell us in one of the workshops a little more about what he's been doing. But so, as I say, just to draw attention to an area that one is anxious to establish links to. Now, the next speakers will tell you about applications at a fairly large scale of the kind of sources that I've been talking about. And to conclude, I just want to note that our resources can be exploited at any scale. 2 recent projects have used a small number of our records in creative ways. Famine Tales, run by the University of Exeter, is collaborating with scroll painters in Bengal to capture some aspects of the histories of Indian famine as recounted in the official records. And Monsoonal Multiplicities is an exhibition which is part of an ERC-funded project which considers how cities might adapt in harmony with monsoons. And in this exhibition, some of our records are mentioned, along with new films, interviews, commissioned artwork, and so on, around the monsoon in Chennai, in Dhaka, and Yangon. And so I encourage you to have a look at both sites because they are very imaginatively conceived. So that concludes this overview. I've put the India Office Records email address there, and if you have questions about the sources I've discussed, do drop me an email or I can pass that on to the relevant person. Our resources, as they're 14 kilometers, they can be challenging to access, difficult to access, but I can say with certainty that they are really well worth the effort. Thank you very much.